Hello, you fine people. So I have once again, thus spake Zarathustra, and a passage that I'm going to read from said book. The passage comes from the chapter called Old and New Tables, which itself is separated into sections. And the section I'm reading is section 19, which might as well be called the Parasite. But it's just 19. So here we go. I form circles around me and holy boundaries. Ever fewer ascend with me, ever higher mountains. I build a mountain range out of ever holier mountains. But wherever ye would ascend with me, O my brethren, take care lest a parasite ascend with you. A parasite that is a reptile, a creeping, cringing reptile that trieth to fatten on your infirm and sore places. And this is its art. It divineth where ascending souls are weary, in your trouble and dejection. In your sensitive modesty doth it build its loathsome nest. Where the strong are weak, where the noble are all too gentle, there buildeth it its loathsome nest. The parasite liveth where the great have small sore places. What is the highest of all species of being, and what is the lowest? The parasite is the lowest species. He, however, who is of the highest species, feedeth most parasites. For the soul which hath the longest ladder, and can go deepest down, how could there fail to be the most parasites upon it? The most comprehensive soul, which can run and stray and row furthest in itself, the most necessary soul, which out of joy flingeth itself into chance, the soul in being, which plungeth into becoming, the possessing soul, which seeketh to attain desire and longing, the soul fleeing from itself, which overtaketh itself in the widest circuit, the wisest soul, unto which folly speaketh most sweetly, the soul most self-loving, in which all things have their current and countercurrent, their ebb and their flow. Oh, how could the loftiest soul fail to have the worst parasites? So one of the reasons that I chose this passage is because, first off, it's one of my favorite passages in the whole book, and second, because it's quite a relatable passage, which is probably why it's one of my favorites. It's relatable insofar as I have various parasites that have tried to prevent me from achieving the kind of spiritual growth that I'm striving for. That's not to say like arrogantly, oh, I'm the highest spiritual being out here. It's more so that like when I went into a more spiritual path, then I noticed that parasites came and attached themselves to me, and we're talking about like actual spiritual entities that I would call interdimensional, but also just like parasitic people. But anyway, I'll probably get into that or not, but here are some lines. So I form circles around me and holy boundaries. Ever fewer ascend with me ever higher mountains. I build a mountain range out of ever holier mountains. So he's establishing this circular divine wall around himself so that he can contain his own creative spirit in such a way that kind of guards that spirit and that energy from any parasitic energies which might want to come in. And when he says ever fewer ascend with me ever higher mountains, he's saying that this boundary that he's establishing is in such a high place that these parasitic energies or maybe something like the rabble can't come and disturb him. And he says, I build a mountain range out of ever holier mountains. So he's creating this sacred space for himself, and the mountains that he's building, we can think archetypally of mountains as places of divinity. And I think particularly of the Taoist tradition where, in most instantiations of Taoism, as far as I've learned, literal mountains are quite sacred. Like when you're walking in the mountains, you're entering sacred spaces, and that's where the Tao is most presently felt, I guess. And also, in some instances of Taoism, maybe all of them, it can be said that the human body actually contains mountains within it. Now, these are in some sense metaphorical mountains, because obviously we're just like a very small body for, like, way too small for vast mountains. But when you enter the highly meditative state, such as maybe one discussed in this passage, then you learn to explore your realms in such a way where you're actually experiencing mountains, that within your deepest self you have such vast infinite lands to explore that contain mountains and all kinds of little worlds. It's connecting the microcosm of the human body with the macrocosm, which would be the mountains and eventually the universe and the Tao. That linking these micro and macro worlds together, you can find such worlds unified in the mountains within. Now, it's a far greater subject, and I probably didn't do it justice, but it's just a parallel that I noticed and that I found quite interesting. So it's worth looking into if anyone else is interested. But wherever ye would ascend with me, O my brethren, take care lest a parasite ascend with you. A parasite, that is, a reptile, a creeping, cringing reptile that trieth to fatten on your infirm and sore places. So the higher you ascend on this spiritual path, on this path of unleashing your creative spirit into the world and pouring this divine will into the world, the more parasites will try to come with you, because these parasites, and we're talking more about like the spiritual, etheric parasites that I know have some experience with. These parasites are going to try to prevent you from reaching that ascension, but also they're going to notice that you have this highly potent divine energy within yourself, and they can't connect directly into that energy, so they have to come attached to a host to feed off of your energy. They've disconnected themselves from that creative spirit, so they rely on someone who's pouring that creative spirit into the world in order to feed themselves. And he calls this force a reptile, a creeping, cringing reptile. And that's quite interesting, because as I've been reading my dreams, in collaboration, I guess, or in conjunction with this spiritual parasite that I know is within me, that I feel on an energetic level, this parasite of mine is of reptilian descent. It is a reptile, just like he's talking about. So it's interesting that archetype is coming about from his psyche, because we're probably talking about very much the same archetypal energy. And that same archetypal energy, I don't know where Nietzsche would stand, but for me would be the serpent in the Garden of Eden. That's like the most evident. I mean, it's Satan, you know. I'm not necessarily affirming the reality of Satan and in turn Christianity. I'm more saying, like, if we take this as a mythological motif and archetype, that there's a certain idea and energy that's represented there, like the embodiment of evil itself, and that is a parasite that I have some serious experience with. And I think he's talking about this kind of thing, so maybe just keep that in mind as I go along. And he goes on, and this is its art. It divineth where ascending souls are weary. In your trouble and dejection, in your sensitive modesty, doth it build its loathsome nest. So such a parasite, or any kind of parasite, will will find your weaknesses on your path towards spiritual awakening, ascension, creative will, whatever you want to call it. And it's going to feed off of those weaknesses that you might have. Let's say that you have like a vice that, in spite of all your efforts, you have a slight inability to conquer. Then that parasite is going to take notice of that vice, and it's going to try to work on that. So here's a good example. Let's say that your life is going really well, you're living as virtuously as possible, and you're very disciplined all the time, and you're willing all kinds of things into the world in a way that's very fruitful. But maybe it turns out, and this is purely hypothetical, you have like a drinking problem where every now and then you'll just get like really drunk, and you'll kind of lose control and lose some of that discipline. So such a parasitic energy, if we're talking about like on the more spiritual side, or maybe a more parasitic person, either of those, which I think Nietzsche is talking about both, will notice that. We'll notice like, oh, he's kind of straying from the path, and now is our chance to attach ourselves energetically to this person in such a way that will distract him from his path. And this could take on all kinds of forms. Like if you're drunk, you could have like a literal demonic parasite that would come and take over your body. That happens. Or you could have like one of these people who is like renowned for taking advantage of people. So anyway, the point is that would be one of the weaknesses, and that would be a moment where you've strayed, and the parasite will come in and attach itself to you, and now you're stuck with a parasite, because these parasites pay attention to when you're straying from the path. So it's important to try as hard as you can not to stray from the path, not to go get blacked out of a party or something, you know? I personally recommend no alcohol, but you do whatever you want. What is the highest of all species of being, and what is the lowest? The parasite is the lowest species. He, however, who is of the highest species, feedeth most parasites. Now, something that's interesting is he's kind of making them interdependent, but I don't think it's interdependence so much as you have the highest species of being, which is capable of sustaining itself of its own will and volition and energy. And that is the highest form of being, when you can tap into your own divine will and energy and become wholly reliant upon that. And the lowest species is the being which has essentially severed itself from such independence and self-sustaining energy, and relies upon others in order to achieve self-sustenance and just survival. And so the parasite relies on the host, but the host only relies on itself. So the lowest kind of person that you can be, according to this, is a person that fails to recognize your own kind of inner divine capacity, so to speak, that fails to actualize the profound human potential that you have within yourself, and that you rely solely upon others for meaning, for survival, and for any kind of self-actualization. So what the implication here is, you should strive to be able to find meaning and happiness and the like creative willing of divinity within yourself, and not have to rely upon anything else in the world in order to pursue those dreams and goals and aspirations. Because otherwise, if you become too dependent, and I guess the more dependent you become, the lower you reach in the realms of like the kind of species that you are, and the closer you get to being just a parasite. And being a parasite is you don't want to be a parasite, because first off, as human beings, we are connected to this divine potential, And if you become a parasite, that means you've severed yourself wholly from that potential. And that's just not, that's like selling your soul to the devil, so to speak. You don't want to do that because there are consequences for such a thing. But anyway, for the soul which hath the longest ladder and can go deepest down, how could there fail to be most parasites upon it? So imagine such a highly spiritual person or spirited person, a willful person, who has kind of come to terms with who they are and have a higher capacity to explore their inner realms by, for example, dream reading or something like that. And when they explore these realms, then they go deeper and deeper into the realms of the human psyche and the human experience and just consciousness itself and just the whole experience of being. And when we explore these realms in their deepest recesses, then that's where so many parasites dwell. And so when we have the courage to go explore such realms, which most people don't, most people like to stay on the rabble level, the masses level, and just kind of be comfortable in mediocrity and just staying alive and doing your thing, which is fine. You do whatever you want. So when you have such courage, then you're far more likely to put yourself in a position when you're exploring the deepest realms of yourself and the universe, where you come to face with some of these parasites and maybe like demonic energies or something like that. You're going to be courageous enough to face those darker sides and to try and conquer them and overcome them with your will. Whereas most people will be content just staying on the surface level. And they may very well have parasites attached to them, and probably to the extent that those parasites like take them over and turn these very people into parasites, but most people are not going to go into the depths to face any darkness or demons or parasitic energies. And they're not going to have very much to offer to any parasitic energies because they don't have like that strong divine connection and strong willing that attracts the parasitic energies. So the most comprehensive soul, which can run and stray and rove furthest in itself, the most necessary soul, which out of joy flingeth itself into chance. So this is a soul that is most familiar with its own inner realms and that can explore most profoundly all of these realms, and it does so in a way that's joyful and ready to just kind of take any possibility that such inner realms or outer realms will have to offer. It's a soul that is fearless, that knows that whatever the world throws at it, it will be able to overcome whatever is thrown at it with its will. The soul in being, which plungeth into becoming, the possessing soul, which seeketh to attain desire and longing. Now, when I think of being and becoming, I think of something like Aristotle's theory of the forms, where you have the potential and the actual. And being would be the potential state, and becoming would be the actualizing state. And so the highest modality of being would be a state where you're in this pure state of potential, but simultaneously you're plunging from that state of potential into self-actualization. You recognize this potential within yourself. You recognize a way that potential can be actualized, and you just actualize it. And it's a seamless process of just beatification, you might say, because you're sanctifying yourself by bringing your divine will into the world, so to speak. And he says, seeketh to attain desire and longing. Now, I'm not sure, and I wonder how this would compare, like, between translations, but just like with the word attain, desire, and longing, I almost think of like overcoming desire and longing, but I don't think that's what Nietzsche would want. I think it's probably more so like taking control of your own desire and longing in such a way where You're just your will is what is in charge of what you desire and what you long for. Your dreams become the captain, so to speak. The soul fleeing from itself, which overtaketh itself in the wisest circuit, the wisest soul, unto which folly speaketh most sweetly. So this is the soul that kind of is trying to escape its own limitations, and which tries to overcome these limitations and just take absolute control of itself, take absolute control and self-ownership and initiative over the kind of being that this self wants to become. And I love that he says, the wisest soul, unto which folly speaketh most sweetly, because this folly that speaks to the soul most sweetly is this divine madness, this almost rapture that comes from becoming so spiritually actualized, where every person throughout history who has actually been connected to divinity has essentially been called by the majority of people who are just the rabble mad and crazy. They just say, oh yeah, that person's crazy, they don't know anything. But really, those people who are quote unquote crazy are the ones who are most deeply connected to the archetypal divine energies that are the foundation of our entire reality. They are the ones most tuned in to the highest reality, to the most divine and pure state of human existence. So that's a folly that I want in my ear for sure. The soul most self-loving, in which all things have their current and countercurrent, their ebb and their flow. Oh, how could the loftiest soul fail to have the worst parasites? So this soul is self-loving, that is, it has come to know itself so deeply and to treat that inner self and that authentic self with self-love. It has discovered that self itself is an embodiment of the love, of the divine love of the Creator himself. And in this self is recognized the ebb and flow, the current and countercurrent. That is the oscillatory nature of being, the symbiotic nature of being, the harmony between dualities, the yin and yang, going back to something like Taoism. That there's this harmonious balance within nature and the entire universe, which lies at the metaphysical foundations of all existence. And that soul has come to terms with that. And then he asks, oh, how could the loftiest soul fail to have the worst parasites? So he's just reiterating this point. The loftiest soul being the highest soul, the most actualized soul, which has achieved all of this connection to divinity, and thus has become a vehicle for that divinity in the world, for that willing of creation, for that creative willing into the world. How could that not attract the parasites, who themselves still require such energy for their sustenance, but cannot find it themselves? I'm talking here about the spiritual parasites and of parasites, of parasitic people who still have that innate capacity and that willful ability to actualize their divine potential, but have renounced it to oftentimes forms of vice, which have just become the barriers to their own self-liberation and self-transcendence and self-actualization. Now, these spiritual parasites and parasitic people are interwoven because the parasitic people are themselves just possessed by the spiritual parasites. When they're addicted to vice, the vice itself is just the medium by which the parasite takes over the host. I think particularly about the biggest parasite that's on this planet, which is the technocratic artificial intelligence network that is basically enveloping this entire world. And that parasite literally uses vice, is like a sea of vice. Obviously, there's also virtuous realms within like the internet or something like that. But I mean, for the most part, people are just absolutely addicted to this sensory gratification that the internet and the screens have to offer us. And that's just one gigantic parasite that pretty much like a matrix system is convincing us that we're getting something out of this system, but really it's just the parasite leeching our energy, our willful potential away from us into itself so that it can create its own false will. But that's a whole different complicated topic. I just wanted to make note of that because here I am pouring my energy into this, for the most part, parasitic network. And I'm doing the opposite of what the parasite wants. Although the parasite is going to try to use my energy to parasite off you who's watching this. But just don't let that parasite in your field. You have to climb the highest mountains, both spiritually and physically, and ascend to the worlds wherein your will and your divine potential can most effectively be actualized. At least that's what I think Nietzsche is saying here. And if not, well, that's what I'm saying. So let's do that. That said, I guess the last thing to say is essentially don't become a parasite, because that's the lowest form of being you could possibly become. Instead, become what you really are. That is, become a being that recognizes its own inherent infinite potential and chooses, no matter what parasites might come along, to actualize that potential into the world and to bring that potential's divinity into the world. That's really what it's all about. And the more you bring that divinity into the world, the more that divinity will be brought back to you.